handling different types of exceptions. So we have a couple options for exception handling beyond just catch exception. The choice exception strategy can contain two or more catch and/or rollback strategies, allowing us to determine which exception strategy we want to use. Individual catch and/or rollback strategies will specify a condition when they should be evaluated. The choice strategy routes the message to the first exception strategy whose condition evaluates as true. And if none of the exception strategies are chosen, it can handle the error, but that message is going to be routed to Mule's default exception strategy. So setting up a strategy based on conditions. What we can do here is reference the message or the exception in our evaluation. So you can see in the bottom here, the execute when box is effectively a Boolean that's going to evaluate whether it's appropriate for that to trigger. For example, we can use things like exception.causedBy and give it an exception parameter, exception.causedExactlyBy, saying that it needs to be the exact type of the exception rather than just potentially an exception that implements or inherits from another exception. And then exception.causeMatches, which will allow us to use wildcards to determine the type of exception we'd like to resolve to, often helpful when you're looking for exceptions from a specific package. Now, bubbling exceptions, a concept that you're likely used to if you've worked with some object-oriented type language. All flows have their own exception strategies, but if a flow does not have an exception strategy defined, the strategy of the calling flow, assuming there is one, will be used. This means that if an exception is thrown in flow B, but flow B was called from flow A, that exception will bubble up to flow A. Walkthrough 8.2, handling different types of messaging exceptions. In this example, we'll add and configure a choice exception strategy. We'll get exceptions handled by both the catch exception strategies in the choice strategy, and we'll create a new flow that calls a flow that has an exception strategy so that that exception can bubble up to the calling flow. Let's get started. Back in Anypoint Studio, we'll make sure that we are in our implementation XML file to get started. We're going to drag a choice exception strategy into the get Delta flights flow. So let's do that now. We'll go back to the design palette. All right. And inside of here, we are going to bring the choice strategy, choice exception strategy, and not inside of Delta flights flow, actually. We're going to drag this slightly outside of it. So it's going to go right above the get Delta flights flow inside of here. All right. Now we're going to take the exception strategy that's inside of the get Delta flights flow, and I'll double click to make this a bit bigger, and we're going to drag that into our choice exception strategy that we just created. So let's drag that up and into the choice exception strategy. So now it is wrapped inside of there. And then we're going to drag a second exception strategy for our choice exception strategy. So I'll double click again here to bring back my other palettes, and we will bring in a catch exception strategy and drag that catch exception strategy right below inside of the choice exception strategy, so we end up with two options inside of here. Now let's drag the choice exception strategy back into get Delta flights flow. You may be able to do this through the graphical interface, but I'm going to do it through the XML in this case because I find it a bit easier to move items around from the XML. From the XML, we can locate the choice exception strategy and copy. Again, if you are in the XML, you have to be careful here. Copy from the beginning tag of choice exception strategy to the end tag. And once that has been copied, we can paste it or cut it and then paste it into the bottom of the get Delta flights flow right inside of here. So I'll do just a little indenting to make it cleaner. Not that that's necessary. And now it should be within, if we go back to message flow, should be within the get Delta flights flow now, which is exactly what we want. Okay, next thing that we're going to do is put some different items inside of that second exception strategy. So back into the palette, I'll double click on implementation tab here to get all my palette back. And I'm going to bring another set payload into this bottom box, followed by another property transformer, and then another logger as well. So it'll be basically a copy of what we've got up top here, but we're going to configure it slightly different. So in this bottom exception strategy, I'll double click on set payload, and inside of set payload, just go ahead and reset my perspective here as well because things have gotten moved around a little bit. Okay, back to the bottom here. So inside of set payload, under value, I'm going to put in at the beginning, data is unavailable. Try later. And then an expression at the very end here that does a break. This will be a lowercase n, of course. And then adds the exception inside of it as well. All right. In the property window, we'll double click on this and hit set property. Once again, we're going to do http.status, but this time the value is going to be 500. All right. So first, we will click on our catch exception strategy in the top up here. Okay. In this first catch exception strategy, we'll change the display name, and we'll have the display name in this case say no flights DW exceptions. This is going to handle when there's no flights and it can't transform the response appropriately. Inside of here, we're going to execute this when the exception dot cause matches. Okay, so that's exception dot cause matches. And then inside of here as an argument, we're going to feed in single quotes, com.mulesoft.weave.asterisk. So basically, any exception from the weave package will expect to catch in this top exception strategy. All right. Now, if we select the catch exception strategy in the bottom, we should change this to say data unavailable, all other exceptions. This will be kind of our catch-all, and we're going to leave execute when blank so that it is basically the otherwise, if you will, of this exception strategy. All right, so let's save up the application again. In this case, we're going to make sure it's in debug mode, so it may still be running for you. Okay, and if it is still running, we're going to go to Postman. And inside of Postman, we'll make the same request to localhost 8081/delta and hit send. Oh, I'll go back to Anypoint Studio and make sure it was actually running. Stop it and try debugging it again. Looks like my console was hidden, so I'm not 100% sure if it was running there. Go to console. All right, failed to deploy. Now, if you did copy over the XML like me, one thing you may get inside of your exception is that the name attribute exception strategy is only allowed to appear in the global elements. So that is one downside to copying in the XML. We need to make sure that that name attribute goes away since this is no longer global. So if you did get an error like this as well, we can just go to configuration XML and scroll all the way to the bottom. And finding our choice exception strategy, you'll find this name parameter in here. We're just going to remove this. Basically, these name attributes are only items you're going to use in global elements. So if they're inside of a flow, they shouldn't be named like this because they're not going to be referenced from other flows or other objects, if you will. So I'm just going to make that quick change in the XML. Let it try to restart here again. All right, and once it's restarted, we'll go back to Postman and send the request in again. Once again, we should be in debug mode so we can step through. All right, now in this case, I sent it up to this exception strategy here. So it's gone and thrown the exception. And we'll put some breakpoints in both of these as well, just to make sure we're able to stop here. Okay, so that'll be on both of our set payloads. I'll hit the green arrow again. And this time you can see, because it wasn't a weave exception, it got caught in that catch-all exception strategy. And as I step through here, it should create the data unavailable message. I can move through, go back to Postman, and see that I've now got a different type of exception response for this type of setup, okay? Now let's fix this up so that we can kind of bring the flow back to its working order and still be able to trigger both of these exceptions. So what we'll do is we'll go back to Anypoint Studio. And from Anypoint Studio, we're going to add a transform message before the web service consumer. So we'll bring in transform message again and double click. Now again, as you know, this is a very simple mapping. We're just going to drag code over to destination so that it maps over that specific attribute. Okay, and then we'll save this up. So that should bring everything back so that we can still make requests that will give us data back, but at the same time, if we request something like foo, it should be smart enough to give us a response that there's no flights to foo. So once this starts up successfully, we'll go back to Postman. And again, localhost 8081 Delta, we'll hit send. Back in Anypoint Studio, we'll step all the way through with the green arrow. Then back in Postman, you can see we're now getting flights back again, which is great. If we go back in here and say code equals foo and hit send, back in Anypoint Studio, if we send this one all the way through, we should see it does get an exception. It gets caught in that top exception strategy for the data weave exception. We move it all the way through, and when we go back to Postman, we are able to see the response, no flights to foo. Okay. Now let's see if we can watch an exception bubble up as we had discussed in the slides. To do this, we're going to return to Anypoint Studio. And from the palette here, we'll go back to design mode. From the palette, let's drag an HTTP endpoint above all of our other flows. So I'm going to put this HTTP endpoint at the very top of our other flows. All right. We'll then double click on this HTTP listener, and we'll choose our existing HTTP listener config, or at least verify it's chosen. And for the path, let's put in flights. Now, this flow is going to call another flow, so let's use the flow reference. And we'll choose our flow reference here and drop down the flow name. All right, and inside of the flow name here, we are going to call the get delta flights flow. All right, we'll click inside. So now we've got an HTTP endpoint, and this calls the get delta flights flow. We'll put a logger at the very end here. That way it's easy for us to debug. And we'll right click on the implementation flow here. And let's rename this. So this specific flow we're going to call get flights flow, and it'll become more important in our larger implementation a bit later. Okay. Now what I want to do in this case is I want to take that exception strategy that we had put down here, and I want to move that up to our main flow, the get flights flow, so that if an exception happens in other places that this flow is calling, it can use that exception handler. So what we'll do here is, again, I'm going to use the config XML. You may be able to drag as well. But if I go all the way down in the config XML and take this choice exception strategy and cut it out, back at the top where we had our flow, we can once again paste this exception strategy at the very end of our flow get flights flow. Okay, so just to show you the full XML, that should now be available inside of here, the beginning to the end of the choice exception, then the flow ends. So if I go to the message flow now, you can see that the exception strategy, the choice exception strategy here, has been moved up to the get flights flow, which is in effect going to call the get delta flights flow. So let's see if this is still able to bubble up as we'd expect. So I'm going to put a breakpoint on the flow reference here. Save the application, and once again, this should restart it. All right. Now we'll go back to Postman and send a request in again for foo. And if we go back to Anypoint Studio, we'll hit yes here. In fact, you can see, since I just called foo again, that was my mistake. Since I just called the delta endpoint here, it's going to go through this main delta flights flow. So this is still accessible through the HTTP endpoint at the beginning. So go ahead and step through. I know it'll give you an error. Push that message all the way through. And in this case, I want to come back and call the get flights flow, which we had exposed on just flights. So let's go back to Postman. And inside of Postman, let's change delta to say flights and hit send. Now back in Anypoint Studio, let's trace this through. So if we step into our flow reference, this is going to take us down to our get delta flights flow. If we move over in our get delta flights flow, you'll see we eventually throw an exception here. Now this time we don't have an error handler because we have moved it up. So if you step forward again you'll see that the exception bubbles back up to the caller via the flow reference. And in a moment here, you might want to put some breakpoints in just to ensure it stops. In a moment here, we should see, just make sure I get the right processor, you should see it drop into this exception strategy. So if I step forward, you can see it pops inside of here. And if we move forward and then go back to our postman, you can see the same exception pops up. So just like in a lot of programming languages, the exceptions will bubble up in your flows just as they would in methods in a modern language. So this is going to be something that we can consider when designing our application.